But by the good hand of God upon the defendants, they were repulsed at Drumclog and put to flight, the prisoners relieved, about 30 of the soldiers killed on the place, and 3 of the meeting, and several wounded on both sides. Thereafter the people, retreating from the pursuit, consulted what was expedient in that juncture, whether to disperse themselves as formerly, or to keep together for their necessary defense. The result was that, considering the craft and cruelty of those they had to deal with, the sad consequence of falling into their hands now more incensed than ever, the evil effects that likely would ensue upon their separation, which would give them access to make havoc of all, they judged it most safe in that extremity for some time not to separate. Which resolution, coming abroad to the ears of others of their brethren, determined them incontinently to come to their assistance, considering the necessity and their own liableness to the same common danger, upon the account of their endeavors of that nature elsewhere to defend themselves, being of the same judgment for maintaining of the same cause, to which they were bound by the same covenants, and groaning under the same burdens. They judged, therefore, that if they now withheld their assistance in such a strait, they could not be innocent in their brethren's blood, nor found faithful in their covenant, to which they were encouraged with the countenance and success the Lord had given to that meeting in that defensive resistance. This was the rise and occasion of that appearance at Bothwell Bridge, which the Lord did in his holy sovereignty confound 4 former defections by the means of division, which broke that little army among themselves, before they were broken by the enemy. They continued together in amiable and amicable peace for the space of 8 or 9 days, while they endeavored to put out and keep out every wicked thing from amongst them, and adhere to the Rutherglen testimony, and that short declaration at Glasgow confirming it, representing their present purposes and endeavors, quote, where only in vindication and defense of the reformed religion, as they stood obliged thereto by the national and solemn league and covenant, and the solemn acknowledgment of sins and engagement to duties, declaring against popery, prelacy, and Erastianism, and all things depending thereupon, unquote. Intending hereby to comprehend the defection of the indulgence, to witness against all which unanimously agreed, until the army increasing, and the defenders and daubers of that defection, some ministers and others came in who broke all, and upon whom the blood of that appearance may be charged. The occasion of the breach was, first, when in the sense of the obligation of that command, when the host goeth forth against thine enemies, keep thee from every wicked thing, an overture was offered to set times apart for humiliation for the public sins of the land, according to the practice of the godly in all ages, before engaging their enemies, and the laudable precedents of our ancestors. And so the causes of God's wrath against the nation might be inquired into and confessed, and the Lord's blessing, counsel, and conduct to and upon present endeavors might be implored. And accordingly, the complying with abjured Erastianism by the acceptance of the ensnared indulgence offered by and received from the usurping rulers was condescended upon among the rest of the grounds of fasting and humiliation so seasonably and necessarily called for at that time. The sticklers for the indulgence refused the overture upon politic considerations, for fear of offending the indulged ministers and gentlemen, and provoking them to withdraw their assistance. This was the great cause of the division that produced such unhappy and destructive effects. And next, whereas the cause was stated before, according to the covenants, in the Rutherglen testimony and Glasgow declaration, wherein the king's interest was waived, these dividers drew upon another large paper called the Hamilton Declaration, wherein they assert the king's interest according to the 3rd article of the Solemn League and Covenant, against which the best affected contended and protested, they could not in conscience put in his interest in the state of the quarrel, being now in stated opposition to Christ's interests, and inconsistent with the meaning of the covenant and the practices of the covenanters and their own testimonies, while now he could not be declared for as being in the defense of religion and liberty, when he had so palpably overturned and ruined the work of Reformation, and oppressed such as adhered thereunto, and had burnt the covenant, etc., whereby he had loosed the people from all obligation to him from it. Yet that contrary faction prevailed so far as to get it published in the name of all, whereby the cause was perverted and betrayed, and the former testimonies rendered errant, and the interest of the enemy, of the public enemy, espoused. Finally, the same day that the enemy approached in fight, and a considerable advantage was offered to do execution against them, these loyal gentlemen hindered and retarded all action till a parley was beat, and an address dispatched to the Duke of Monmouth, who then commanded his father's army, by which nothing was gained but free liberty given to the enemies to plant their cannon and advance without interruption. After which, in the wholly all overruling providence of God, that poor handful was signally discountenanced of God, deprived of all conduct, divested of all protection, and laid open to the raging sword. The just punishment of all such tamperings with the enemies of God, and espousing their interest, and omitting humiliation for their own and the land's sins. About 300 were killed in the fields, and 1,000 and upwards were taken prisoners, stripped, and carried to Edinburgh, where they were kept for a long time in Greyfriars Churchyard, without shelter from cold and rain, and at length had the temptation of an ensnaring bond of peace, wherein they were to acknowledge that insurrection to be rebellion, and oblige themselves never to rise in arms against the king, nor any commissionate by him, and to live peaceably, etc., which, through fear of threatened death, and the unfaithfulness of some, and the impudence of other ministers that persuaded them to take it, prevailed with many. Yet others resolutely resisted, judging it to imply a condemning of their duty, and abandoning of their covenant engagements, wherein they were obliged to duties inconsistent with such bonds, and a voluntary binding up their hands from all oppositions to the declared war against Christ, which is the native sense of the peace they require, which can never be entertained long with men so treacherous. And therefore, upon reasons of principle and conscience, they refused that pretended indemnity offered in these terms. Nevertheless, the most part took it, and yet were sentenced with banishment and sent away for America, as well as they who refused it, and, by the way, if you accepted, perished in shipwreck, whose blood yet cries both against the imposers and the persuaders to that bond. Number 3. This fearful and fatal stroke at Bothwell not only was in its immediate effects so deadly, but in its consequence so destructive, that the decaying Church of Scotland, which before was beginning to revive, was then cast into such a swoon that she is never like to recover to this day. And the universality of her children, which before espoused her testimony, was after that partly drawn by craft, and partly drawn by cruelty from a conjunction with their brethren in prosecuting the same, either into an open defection to the contrary side, or into a detestable indifferency and neutrality in the cause of God. For, first of all, the Duke of Monmouth, whose nature, more averse from cruelty than the rest of that progeny, made him pliable to all suggestions of wicked policy that seemed to have a show of smoothness and lenity, procured the emission of a pretended indemnity attended with a foresaid bond of peace for its companion, which were dreadful snares, catching many with flatteries and fair pretenses of favors, fared over with curious words and cozening names of living peaceably, etc., while in the meantime a most deadly and destructive thrust, as it were under the fifth rib, because most secret, was intended against all that was left remaining of the work of God undestroyed, and a bar put upon all essays to revive, to recover it, by their own consent who should endeavor it. This course of defection carried away many at that time, and from that time, since the taking of the bond of peaceable living, there hath been an universal preferring of peace to truth, and of ease to duty. And the generality have been left to swallow all baits, though the hook was never so discernible, all those ensnaring oaths and bonds imposed since, which both then and since people were left to their own determination to choose or refuse, many ministers refusing to give their advice when required and requested thereunto, and some not being ashamed or afraid to persuade the people to take them. The ministry then also were generally ensnared with that bonded indulgence, the pretended benefit of that indemnity, which, as it was designed, so it produced the woeful effect of propagating the defection and promoting the division, and laying them by from their duty and testimony of that day, which to this day they have not yet taken upon their former ground. For when a proclamation was emitted inveighing bitterly against field meetings, and absolutely interdicting all such for the future under highest pain, but granting liberty to preach in houses upon the terms of a cautionary bond given for their living peaceably, yet excluding all these ministers who were suspected to have been at the late rebellion, and all these who shall afterward be admitted by nonconform ministers, and certifying that if ever they shall be at any field conventicle, the said indemnity shall not be useful to such transgressors any manner of way, and requiring security that none under the color of this favor continue to preach rebellion. Though there seems to be enough in the proclamation itself to have scared them from this scandalous snare, yet a meeting of ministers at Edinburgh, made up of indulged avowed applauders of the indulgence, or underhand approvers and favourers of the same, and some of them old public resolutioners, assuming to themselves the name of a General Assembly, yea, of the representatives of the Church of Scotland, voted for the acceptance of it, and so formally transacted and bargained upon base, dishonest, and dishonorable terms with the usurper, by consenting and compacting with the people to give that bond, wherein the people upon an humble petition to the council, quote, obtaining their indulged minister to bind and oblige that the said shall live peaceably, and in order thereto to present him before his Majesty's Privy Council, when they shall be called to do so, and in case of salzi, in not presenting him, to be liable to the sum of 6,000 merks, unquote, whereby they condemned themselves of former unpeaceableness, and engaged in a sinful peace with the enemies of God, and became bound and fettered under these bonds to a forbearance of a testimony, and made answerable to their courts, and the people were bound to present them for their duty. The sinfulness, scandalousness, and inconveniences of which transactions are abundantly demonstrated by a treatise thereupon, entitled The Banders Disbanded. Nevertheless, many embraced this new bastard indulgence, that had not the benefit of the former brat, of the same mother the supremacy, and far more consented to it without a witness, and most of all did some way homologate it in preaching under the sconce of it, declining the many reiterated and urged calls of the zealous lovers of Christ to come out and maintain the testimony of the gospel in the open fields for the honor of their master and the freedom of their ministry.